Hello everyone, I'm George from Ireland. So I'm going to talk about the one scandal in international affairs that nobody seems to be talking about, even though it's not secret and it's in the news, and that is the attempted annexation of even more of Palestine. So Israel has been illegally occupying much of Palestine since 1967. Obviously, Israel was created in 1948 by the United Nations. I know Israelis might say it was recreated because it existed centuries before, until the Romans expelled the Jews from their homeland. But anyway, the United Nations gave 2/3 of Mandate Palestine to the Israelis and 1/3 of mandatory Palestine to the Palestinians. The Palestinians are Arabs, as in Arabic is their first language. Great majority of them are Muslims, Sunni Muslims, and a small minority are Christians. So many of them lived there for centuries, and yes, they're often they're related to the neighboring nationalities, Jordanians and Egyptians. But there was a war in 1948. The Palestinians did not agree to 1/3 of their land being given away, especially as the Palestinians were 2/3 of the population but got 1/3 of the land. So the Israelis did accept the deal. Not surprisingly, they were getting something that had nothing before, and they're 1/3 of the population getting 2/3 of the land. The two infant countries, Israel and Palestine, supposed to share Jerusalem as a capital. That didn't last long. Anyway, the Palestinians they were assisted by their fellow Ishmaelites, but they lost that war. And Gaza, that's the western part of Palestine, was then administered by Egypt, whereas the West Bank, as into the west of the River Jordan, that bit of Palestine, was administered by Jordan. Now, some Israelis say, well, they were illegally occupied by other Arabs and nobody objects about that. Well, it was at the invitation of the Palestinians. The Palestinians didn't take exception to this. They were a fledgling state. They were very feeble, desperately trying to recover from the war. So they welcomed the assistance of the Egyptians and indeed the Jordanians. They were their co-religionists and they spoke the same language. They lived the same culture. Yeah, they're quite similar. People sometimes talk about the Arab nation, or the Arabs are a family of nations. There's the Arab League. So there's some sense of a fraternity between Arabs, not to say they've never fought each other. Just as Jews have sometimes fought against each other. But then there's the 1967 war, and so the Palestinians and their fellow Arabs are defeated again. The Israelis get the whole of Jerusalem, and they start to occupy Gaza, the West Bank, and then Sinai. Obviously, the Israelis returned Sinai to Egypt about a decade later. So then the Israelis started to create facts on the ground, these settlements, as they call them, illegal settlements, just grabbing land, sometimes at gunpoint, I mean literally booting Palestinians out of their home. So the Palestinians call it al-Nakba, as in the catastrophe. So in 1948, a lot of Palestinians fled, moved to Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt, and other countries. In 1967, even more of them fled. So there are lots of people of Palestinian blood around the world. There's a Palestinian national charter saying anyone whose father is a Palestinian is Palestinian. So they choose it to go patrilineally, just like Orthodox Jews generally say that Jewishness goes matrilineally. Anyway, so settlement has this cozy feel to it. Most of us would like to settle down, rather than calling them colonies or just illegal construction sites. So the thing is, some Israelis have been living there for over 50 years. Some Jewish people who are not Israeli citizens have also been living there. So we have to think about their rights. You could be a child who was born there in these illegal settlements to parents who were also born there, possibly even your grandparents. Some of these people are ultra-Orthodox Jews, so the so-called settlers who lived in these illegal sites, and they tend to get married very young and have several children. So I don't want them to suffer. I don't want the Palestinians to suffer. And some Palestinians living nearby can say, and that was our house. Some elderly people, that really was their house they were driven out of. Sometimes people say it's my parents or grandparents lived there. So the United Nations said in 1967 that Israel's got to withdraw at the earliest convenience, return this to the Palestinians, and they've never, ever done this. So that's terrible. I feel very badly for the Palestinians. And there was a lot of Arab solidarity for some time. There were the three no's: no peace with Israel, no negotiation with Israel, no recognition of Israel. Now, some countries broke ranks like Egypt did, and gradually Jordan did, and more of them did. So there are many Palestinians living in other Arab countries, some of them dual citizens of Palestine and Jordan, for example. The majority of Jordanians are actually of Palestinian stock. And so some Zionists try to say, oh, Jordan is Palestine, and so they've got no right to be here, which is preposterous. I mean, there are more Jewish people in in the United States than there are in Israel, which is not to say that that's the Jewish homeland or that Jews have got no right to be in Israel. So Israel exists. Should have been created or not is debatable, but it does exist. It's a sovereign state recognized by many countries. Palestine is also recognized by many countries. It can't get into the United Nations because the United States and Israel block it. So, and that's terrible. Not every country in the world recognizes Israel. Just call it the Zionist entity and so on. So, got to feel very, very sorry for these Palestinians who are booted out. And I know Jewish people have suffered appallingly through the centuries, often at the hands of Christians. It's until, say, the 20th century, Christians tended to be more anti-Semitic than Muslims. Remember, well, Semite in its proper sense means an Arab or a Jew. They're all meant to be descendants from Shem in the Bible. Ham, Shem, and Japheth, the sons of Noah. So Christianity's got a horrific record of anti-Semitism. I'm not saying that all Christians were anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish to be exact. So yes, I do feel very sorry for them, but that's just because the Jewish people were treated abominably, and they certainly were. And in the 1940s, a third of the Jewish population in the world was murdered in the space of only 3 years. That doesn't mean that treating Palestinians unjustly is right either. Nobody should suffer discrimination, and there have been many appalling things that have been done to Palestinians, racially discriminated against, having to drive on Arab-only roads and their Jewish-only roads. You wouldn't accept white-only roads in some countries and black-only roads in the same country, things like that, having to have a separate kind of car registration plate, and obviously quite often tortured when they're caught. Thousands of their civilians killed since 1967, and I mean thousands in the Intifada, and they're Palestinians who've done terrible things to Israelis and to other Palestinians, deliberately targeting civilians on many occasions, just like the Israeli Defense Forces has. Now, the IDF has got state-of-the-art technology. It's got so many ways to minimize civilian casualties. Okay, they do take some steps, but they often deliberately inflict civilian casualties. So we're often told that a country has a right to self-defense. Well, that's true. Palestine has a right to self-defense, or that a country should be secure behind its own borders. You're right, Palestine should be secure behind its own borders. So those who say, oh, the Palestinians, they're not a real people, they're invented people, well, so are the Israelis. I mean, they're often not really the same ethnicity. Only 75% of Israelis are Jewish. Some of them don't practice Judaism. Some of them are only a fraction Jewish, like let's say Russian Jews are only like 1/8 Jewish. A lot of them don't even speak Hebrew, and on and on. And the Palestinians, well, they can all speak Arabic, and almost all of them have the same religion. And yes, they've got a lot in common with neighboring countries. If they want to join Egypt and Egypt lets them join, fine. Or want to join Jordan and Jordan lets them join, fine. But they don't want to be Israeli, and Israel doesn't want them either. So they're being terribly treated. There's an outrageous thing that's been done, this land grabbing, and of course they got the fulsome backing of the United States. Will support them to the hilt. No matter what appalling crime is committed, the United States will always speak up for the oppression of the Palestinians. They're being tyrannized. But when they resist, it's often called terrorism. And sometimes they do this, they fight by unethical means. The Palestinians, it's true. Almost every country is an army, and Palestine is no exception. But I'm not sure why this would be terrorism. Okay, sometimes they don't wear uniforms. Therefore, outside the Geneva Convention, the Israeli forces often don't wear uniforms either, operating in civilian clothes, assassinating people abroad, abusing the passports of friendly countries like the Republic of Ireland to kill an unarmed man in Dubai 10 years ago, and on and on. Now, I've got to hand it to the Israelis for at least being honest about torturing people. They called it moderate physical pressure. And I know many of the neighboring countries have a far worse record on the human rights than Israel. That is true, but Israel's is still bad as well. Anyway, so this is unacceptable. It's an abomination that the Palestinians have lost so much, almost all their land being stolen, their noses rubbed in humiliation. Unsurprising, they fight back. People have a right to rebel. The United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says that, to which Israel is a signatory and is ratified. People who are severely oppressed, are entitled to rebel. The Palestinians are under illegal enemy military occupation, a particularly brutal occupation, for decades. They've strived to get along. They've made painful concessions. Almost everything has been taken away from them. Their land has been stolen from them without a penny in assessment. Even their very name has to be taken away from them, told that they're not Palestinians, that they don't count, and on and on and on. Life made unbearable by Israeli controlling their borders and their airspace and their territorial waters, being able to cut off water, electricity, gas, and then being told it's generosity if they're allowed these things, because they're not allowed to develop their own facilities, they'll be destroyed if they are, and on and on. So sadly, the other Arab countries have really deserted them. They've thought there's a forlorn hope. Saudi Arabia is far more interested in actually enlisting Israeli support against Iran. It's a jaw-dropping axis. They've made this sort of Faustian pact with what they used to call the Zionist entity against the Persians. So it is just lugubrious to reflect that they're going to get away with it. We live in a very immoral world where bad guys so often win. And I know they're admirable things about Israel, and I know they've got women's rights and gay rights and freedom of expression, and all that. I take my hat off to them for that, and I wish Arab countries were like this too. But Israel and the United States, they have so often backed despots against democrats in other Arab countries. It's partly their fault the way it's like this. So it is outrageous. It's shocking. It's disgusting. But, crime pays just so often that and the Israelis can do these things. And there's obviously Zionist domination of the media in the United States. I'm not anti-Semitic. No one should be mistreated for being Jewish. And there are Jewish people who agree with me. And not all Jewish people are Zionists. And most Zionists are not Jewish. A lot of Zionists are evangelical Christians in the United States. But can you think of many anti-Zionist voices in the American media? No. Can you think of a single anti-Zionist politician in the United States? No. Now, I accept Israel's right to exist, but I also accept Palestine's right to exist, which is a nation by any definition you would choose. Anyway, so it's appalling, it's unjust, it's illegal what's happening. The Palestinians being oppressed in an outrageous way. These are not light or transient complaints they have. They've suffered for decades the most outright degradation and the deprivation of their rights. So it is not surprising that they take up arms in this battle for self-assertion. So there we are. They're going to get away with it. No one's going to come to their aid. Jordan is effectively neutered. Egypt has got its own travails under this dictator El-Sisi. He's wanting to get them into this war against Libya. The Syrians have been slaughtering each other for 9 years now, with many other countries piling in this free-for-all. Lebanon is far too small and weak. Iraq is obviously fighting a civil war, somewhat involved with what's going on in Syria, trying to stay out of a possible conflict in Iran, and on and on. And nobody is there to come to the aid of the Palestinians, who are virtually defenseless. So it's shocking and depressing, and they're going to get away with it. Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, is up to his neck in corruption. He's desperate to distract from his peculation and cupidity. And so that's why he's taking this ultra-nationalistic, irredentist step of seizing territory illegally. And when court judgments go against them in the International Court of Justice in The Hague, like this illegal wall they built on stolen land, they just disregard it. They got away with it. There's nothing more legal or peaceful than that, than a lawsuit that they took out. They won't let the Palestinians join anything. Any of the United Nations cultural organizations is outrageous when they have no peaceful means of redress. When peaceful protest is treated with brutality, when they're shot dead in the streets for asserting their rights, what else would you expect them to do but to fight in self-defense? And as they are under illegal occupation, that is self-defense, as their land has been stolen. If the Israelis and the Americans just paid Palestinians to renounce their rights, that might be better, but they're not going to do so. And there are obviously several million people, Palestinians, who live, the Palestinian diaspora, are living elsewhere. The victims of the victims, as Edward Said said. So I wish that there could be peace and mercy, a one-state solution, two-state solution. I don't see a one-state solution as being viable. The Palestinians and Israelis becoming a single people, because the whole idea is Jewish exceptionalism, Jewish separatism, and I have some sympathy for that because they were a minority everywhere. They were butchered in huge numbers throughout centuries. They felt the only way they would find security and be able to live their identity to the fullest was to have a country where they were the majority. a land without a people for a people without a land was based on the fallacy that Palestinians are not people, and some Zionists seem to purport to think that the Arabs do not count as human beings. It's an appallingly racist notion, just like it's a sickeningly racist notion that Jewish people are bad or don't count, something like that. No one should be discriminated against for their faith or their ethnicity. And I know there's not a racial and religious bigotry in the Middle East. I'm not suggesting that most Middle Easterners are like that, but a significant minority are. So it's very dispiriting that the most appalling crimes, people get away with them. These heinous offences are often actively supported by the United States, who provides weaponry for free, provides arms, as I said, will provide money, diplomatic support, and advocacy for these outrageous offences against human rights. And Hillary Clinton is one of the foremost advocates of crimes against humanity, committed on an almost daily basis against the much put upon and maligned Palestinian people. So there we go. I can't offer a glimmer of hope, I'm afraid. So please follow my YouTube channel. Toodaloo.